Shabbat Shalom. On this Shabbat, we welcome the beginning of the fifth book of the Torah, Devarim, also called somewhat confusingly Deuteronomy, but more about that later. The opening verse of this text reads, "These are the words that Moshe addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Yarden." This was at the time of the completion of the 40 years journey in the Midbar. I don't know about you, but I have watched with some fascination the travels of Michael Portillo, using Bradshaw's 1913 Guide to Europe as he traveled by train from London to Paris to Nice and onward throughout Europe. It's been fascinating. It's been amazing to see what was the same and what had changed in all of the places that he visited. But even more fascinating for a student of the scriptures or a child of Israel is the guidebook to our travels as a people from the land of Egypt to the land of promise. The following poem was written by a fellow rabbi about this journey that we have taken as a people. We've been on the road a long time, feels like 40 years. In fact, are you the same travelers who set out with me? Sometimes I imagine you're their children. Maybe you've just grown up along the harsh and winding way. Remember the day we set out? A mixed multitude straggling through the brackish waters. Remember the day I realized I couldn't lead this trip alone. Remember the day we sent runners to scout where we were going, but you were afraid of the prospect of entering somewhere new, maybe being changed by the experience. The wandering, the fighting, the wadis we crossed, the story will take hours to retell. But now, close your eyes, take a breath, and remember where we've been. What moved you? What surprised you? After a journey like this one, no one is exactly the same as on the day of departure from that other home so far away. From Moshe's perspective, obviously. Moshe began to speak about the journey that we've been on to our people. And he spends considerable time, in fact, most of the book of Devarim, reminding us of where we have been. More to the point, he is telling a new generation about their parents' experiences, but in a way which indicates that these occurrences were actually part of their own lives. The entire book of Devarim might be read as a description or a history of our journeys in the wilderness. And it concludes with Moshe's final blessing to our people before he dies. His death marks the end of the Torah and comes just at the moment when Israel is preparing to enter the land of promise. Our destiny awaits. This book of the Torah marks a kind of pause in our onward journey Soon we will go forward to the destination that God intends for us. So this is both a spiritual and a physical crossroads for us. Moshe is saying, before you move on with your new leader and your new life, I want you to remember where we as a people have been, what has brought us to this day and to this place. Before we enter the land, we must be spiritually as well as physically prepared. And for that to happen, we must look back and see where we have been. Some wise person has said, and it's attributed to a number of people, if you do not learn from history, you are bound to repeat it. This is, in fact, of course, a truism, as we see from history, that mostly people don't learn, and they do repeat the mistakes of others, as well as going on to make their own new mistakes. Sometimes we even repeat our own mistakes. As a student of history with degrees in history, I cannot help but mention that we have many historical examples of the phenomenon of history repeating itself, but none so blatant as that of Hitler's incursion into Russia. More than a century earlier, Napoleon, who was one of the greatest generals ever to take the field, marched his magnificent imperial army into a Russian autumn. Despite the fact that winter in Russia was no picnic on the Côte d'Azur, he lost hundreds of thousands of men. And some say that France has never been the same. And he crawled back to France, defeated, his tattered and broken army all but destroyed. Adolf Hitler, despite the advice of his generals and anyone who knew anything, followed in Napoleon's footsteps, making precisely the same errors. He overextended his supply lines. He underestimated the time it would take to subdue the Russian bear, and he fought a two-front war, which everyone knows is a bad idea. The Germans killed more than 10 million Russians, and they left Russia. Mind you, Adolf didn't go personally. They left Russia no wiser for this experience. This is what the psalmist has to say about the lessons of history. Listen, people, to my teaching. Turn your ear to what I say. I will expound a theme, hold forth on the lessons of the past, things we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not withhold them from their children, telling the coming generation the praises of Adonai and his might, and the wonders he performed. He established a decree in Yaakov, ordaining a teaching in Israel, charging our fathers to make them known to their children, that a future generation might know, children yet to be born, and in turn tell their children, that they might put their confidence in God, but observe his commandments, and not be like their fathers, a wayward and defiant generation, a generation whose heart was inconstant, whose spirit was not true to God. Tehillim 178. We have a tradition in Judaism, dor lador, from generation to generation. Each generation has a responsibility to the generation that follows, handed down from those who went before us. And so we come to Devarim, the fifth sefer of the Torah. And you might ask, what's in a name? Deuteronomy is the English name, which is taken from the Latin, and it means second law. And that suggests a complete misunderstanding, in fact, a misreading of Devarim 17, verse 18. It is a misrepresentation of the purpose and intention of this book written by Moshe Rabbeinu, because this is not a second law. It is a reminder of Torah, a retelling of Torah, even a summation of Torah, written for a new generation, the generation who would do what our parents refused to do. Be'ivrit, that means in Hebrew, the name is Sefer HaDevarim, which means Book of the Words. That's a wonderful name, really. It's taken from the first phrase of this book, Aleh HaDevarim Asher De'aver Moshe al ki le'Israel bi Aver HaYarden. These are the words that Moshe addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Yarden. When did you last read this book? Probably not since last year at this time. It has been described by major biblical scholars as the very heart of Torah, and yet it probably is read less than some of the other books of the Torah. Even a man like Martin Luther, who despised and abused the Jewish people, could comment that this book is a compendium and summary of the whole law and wisdom of the people of Israel, wherein those things which related to the priests and the Levites are omitted, and only such things included as the people are generally required to know. A compendium and a summary. Devarim is rightly described by 20th century Christian theologian Dr. Arno Gaebelein as a description, explanation, and enforcement of the most essential contents of the covenant revelation and covenant laws made by God for and with his people Israel, with emphatic prominence given to the spiritual principle of the Torah, that is, God's instruction to us, and its fruition, and with a further development of the ecclesiastical, judicial, political, and civil organization, which was intended as a permanent foundation for the life and well-being of the people in the land which God had given to us forever. Obedience is the central theme of Devarim. As we hear the cry for holiness in Vayikra, so we see in Devarim the call to obedience which is demanded and required as a consequence of redemption. A consequence of redemption. We are called to agree with God's requirements for redemption, to submit to the instructions and the commandments of God, and to comply fully with God's plan and His program. This obedience is demonstrated in the spirit of love, which flows from a blessed and joyful relationship with our God, because it is a covenant relationship. Deference to God, awe of God, fear of God should be our pleasure and our delight. We should be pleased to draw near to God through observing His Torah commandments and His instructions. In fact, we cannot have an intimate relationship with God without such obedience. He tells us this is impossible. God as creator has the right to expect the love and obedience of His people, the people He created for Himself. As a potter creates a bowl, it has a purpose, a specific purpose, in relationship perhaps to the potter himself, for his use, certainly to designate its use in any way He chooses, because He made it. So God has the right to expect this love and obedience from His people. But love is expressed through obedience. Obviously, this is true not only of the physical people of Israel, but of all people who desire God's favor, Jews by birth, Jews by choice. Mashiach Yeshua confirms this perspective. He says in Yochanan 14:21, "He who keeps my commandments, it is he who loves me." And in Yochanan 15, verse 10, "If you keep my commandments, you abide in my love." And in Yochanan 14:24, pardon me, "He that loves me keeps my sayings." His commandments, His sayings. What is He talking about here? He's speaking as God, because certainly no rabbi could say, "You must keep my commandments." He is speaking as God. And if the words of Torah are not His words, then to whom may we attribute them? So when He talks about His commandments, He's not talking about something new that He's come up with. If you look through all that He says, and in fact, throughout the whole of the representation of Yeshua in the words of the Besorah, then you will find that they all are referenced back to the commandments of Torah. The book of Devarim was important in the first century as a source of empowerment to all followers of Mashiach Yeshua, whether they were Jews by birth or not. Rav Yeshua quoted Devarim 6, verse 13 and 16, and chapter 8, verse 3, and chapter 10, verse 20, in response to Hasatan's temptings. So he himself did what he tells us to do, which is to stand upon the express words of God, his words. Yochanan, Yaakov, and Rav Shaul utilized Devarim extensively in their writings and teachings. But of course, if you never read Devarim, you don't know that. Devarim is a prophetic book. Its author, Moshe, is known as the greatest of our prophets. He is called Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. God's entire plan for the nation and people of Israel is delineated in Devarim, particularly in chapter 32. Devarim provides a vision of the future, which corresponds exactly with our national history. Moshe is declared by God to have been found faithful in the writings of to the Ivritim, to the Hebrews, chapter 3, verse 5, and at the very conclusion of his commission as the leader of our people, according to all that the Lord had given him. As with Abraham, Moshe is noted because he was obedient. He was faithful to God, an example to his generation and to those who followed, the one person by whom all others of his generation are judged. God speaks to us through Devarim. Hear, O Israel. He challenges us, not only the physical descendants of Israel, but all those who have chosen to join themselves with Israel, to follow and obey and love the God of Israel. See, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them the way the Lord our God is near us when we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today? He says, listen, learn, and act accordingly. Devarim 4, verses 5 through 8. God speaks powerfully and directly to the Bnei Israel, to those who are perhaps hearing these words for the first time. We are descendants of Yaakov and of the mixed multitude, all now part of this one nation, Israel. He reminds us of what he has done for us, not merely for our parents and our grandparents. And this is before we've entered and occupied the land. We too are commanded to be responsible to walk worthy of him. And this statement includes a serious warning to those of us who might choose to forget or to disobey his commandments. Israel's unique status as the chosen and covenant nation of the one and only God is reaffirmed in Sefer Devarim. But Israel is not merely a spiritual entity, as some wish us to believe. Israel is a cultural, historical, ethnic people with all the attributes of peoplehood and the DNA to match. These include a common history, language, God, legal system, and goals to be achieved, as well as a land, which is called the Land of Israel. God gave Israel the responsibility for his divine and eternal revelation. Israel and God are bound together, past, present, and future, forever, God says. And God warns and exhorts Israel as a loving parent exhorts a child, knowing that Israel will yield to temptation, telling us in advance the result of our rejection of his instruction and his warnings, which of course is exile and alienation. But he promises that he will provide a way back through redemption, reconciliation, revival, and restoration. God's proclamation to Israel is a call to action. He commands us to hear. And this is repeated more than 30 times and implies listening and acting upon what we hear. He uses learn 7 times, encouraging us to be changed by the impact of his instructions. Keep is repeated 39 times, demanding that nothing he gives us should be disavowed or changed or ignored or thrown away. And 100 times he says do. 100 times we are commanded to act upon what we have heard and learned and kept. Obedience to God demands hearing, learning, keeping, and doing. There's nothing here about having warm, fuzzy feelings or acting because we feel that we should. The first and greatest commandment is reiterated, as Rav Yeshua would later confirm. We demonstrate our love of God in understanding his nature, his character, and his purposes with our hearts. Our hearts are the center of our affections, with our souls, the center of our will and desires, with our strength, indicating application and purpose. If you love God, if you say you love God, then you will do his will, you will follow his commandments in complete obedience. Yes, it is as simple as that. And what are the ramifications of loving God in this way? Listening, learning, keeping, and doing God's commandments allows you, if you would have entered into a personal relationship with God through the substitutionary atonement of Mashiach Yeshua, to possess all the promises of God that he makes to his children, those who are part of his kingdom, the nation and people of Israel. Israel was commanded to follow God so that we might possess the land that he had given us. We have never fully possessed all his promises. because we failed to keep his commandments. God makes it clear that his power is released in our lives only when we accept his standards, obey his instructions, and live in righteousness. When you live the lifestyle he has established for us. In the future, when your son asks you, what is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord our God commanded you? Tell him, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord sent miraculous signs and wonders, great and terrible, upon Egypt and Pharaoh and his whole household. But he brought us out from there to bring us in and give us the land that he promised on oath to our forefathers. The Lord commanded us to obey these decrees and to fear the Lord our God, so that we might always prosper and obey all this law before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us. That will be our righteousness. This perspective is for everyone, Jews by birth and those who come out from among the Goyim to become part of Israel, Jews by choice. Obedience to God's commands is righteousness. There's no righteousness without obedience, and there is no power without righteousness. Each generation, each individual must learn Torah anew. Like faith itself, the knowledge of God's Torah is not something one can hold on to for another. Torah is a living, vibrant reality to those who take hold of it. As we say in the Etz Chaim, it is a tree of life. The power of the Torah lies in keeping it. Only when Torah is written on your heart can you take full possession of all that God has for you. So, as we say each week, teach it diligently to your children, not only the next generation, all our children, but also those who come as babies into faith in Mashiach Yeshua and those new to covenant Judaism. Speak of it when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down and when you rise up. As we say in one of the nighttime prayers, blessed be the Lord by day, blessed be the Lord by night, blessed be the Lord when we lie down, blessed be the Lord when we rise up. Bind it for a sign upon your hand. Let it teach your hands to serve. Let it always be before your eyes to guide you. Write it on the doorposts of your dwelling and at the entrance to your property, so that all will know you love and honor Hashem, Lord of creation, King of all the earth. Devarim tells us that Torah should be within us and without. You should surround yourself with Torah. It is your strength and your shield against the evil one and his followers, whether they are human or supernatural. Make Torah a living, breathing reality in your life. In this way, God will be honored and glorified in you and through you, and your life's journey here on earth will be filled with positive stops and will move to a wonderful and joyous conclusion. I hope that this encourages you as we look further into this book of the Torah in our forward journey. God bless and keep you today, and Shavua Tov for the week ahead.